We'll start our afternoon session with number 21, County Council's Office. Barbara?
In addition to our office, we're also having Tim from MBS, Seufert, and Nadia Costa from Miller Star present this. So Tim is going to start with a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to jump in and explain a couple of maps that we have for you. And then after we do the presentation, then we can have some questions from the board and facilitate some discussion about how to best move forward.
Thank you. We have a clicker thing, or just use the mouse, or?
I think just use the mouse.
Okay. Didn't work.
You go from the beginning.
Yeah, from the beginning, yeah.
And I think it will also do a page down.
Okay. Did you want to make any other introduction? Should I just roll right into it?
You can roll right into it, but I know that we're actually having a little bit of discussion this morning, and just as a general overview, the board knows that we've traditionally financed new subdivisions, the services that are provided with new subdivisions through CSAs. In a couple of the larger subdivisions that have been approved recently, we've moved towards a CFD financing structure. And the board, several years ago, decided that they wanted to have the CSAs not as the standard option for subdivisions. So the ordinance that would previously required subdivisions to have a CSA was changed so that a homeowners association would be formed or other mechanism that was approved by the Board of Supervisors. So like some of the smaller subdivisions that the board is seeing now is homeowners associations, if they can be formed to provide all the services. And we haven't formed a new CSA for a few years, but we're going to go over the pros and cons of CSAs and CFDs and HOAs and try to facilitate a board's understanding about what policies and mechanisms that we should use in the future to provide the services for the public in the new subdivisions, whether it be street lighting, street sweeping, road maintenance, etc. So I'll let you.
Actually, before you continue, in this discussion, we'll talk about the added pieces of like sheriff services and all that stuff too, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
So good afternoon. Tim Seufert from NBS. And we're going to try to kind of go through this and make it as useful as possible, but it is, a lot of the terminology is a bit arcane and confusing, and some of the things have changed significantly. One of the things that did change a few years ago, 2009 to be exact, was the CSA law was completely rewritten and sort of rationalized, as I call it, because it was pretty cumbersome before that. It had like 150 sections, and now it's 50 sections, and they tried to tune it up so that it made more sense with Prop 218. Right, so of course you got Prop 13 as sort of the granddaddy of it all, and then you had Prop 218, which affects revenues, and of course Prop 26, which I'm sure you guys are, generally familiar with those, but how they sort of all fit together, I'll try to make that make sense in a fairly short period of time. This I just put in just kind of thought-provoking as I think about this. I was just at a conference where Chris Thornburg, if you've ever seen him, he speaks at a lot of like city, county, finance officer associations and stuff. He's talking about, it's time to talk about revenue now when times are good versus when they're not so good. Barbara had put these maps in just to kind of reference everybody to where we're at.
Yes, GIS prepared these maps for us, and it's really useful to show how the subdivisions that we've historically financed through CSAs have been spread out throughout the county. In this one, we only have one that's actually been formed as a CFD. It's in the green. The two other subdivisions which have proposed CFDs are in kind of a yellowish-brown color. And then the active CSAs are in the blue, and they're spaced out throughout the county. Let's see. Or down arrow.
I'll try it.
Okay. Back in like 2009, 2010, we went through the 218 process for the first time. And as a result of that, there were several CSAs that did not form or approve a fee for the services that had been historically provided in those CSAs. And at that time, the board made a decision that no further services would be provided until a fee was proposed or approved by the landowners in those CSAs. So this is a map, shows the inactive CSAs that are existing in the county. And then it also shows the CFDs again. And this one's like a combination map that shows both the inactive and the active CSAs as they're spaced out through the county. We don't have a track of HOAs through the county, but of course there's numerous HOAs that are also formed throughout the county, but there was no way for us to map those. There you go. Yep.
Is there a CSA that is inactive, that is for county-wide fire? I'm sorry. Thanks. Barbara, is there a CSA that's inactive, that's county-wide, that was established for fire that just was never?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Okay, so that's not shown on this map.
That's not
either.
shown. It's a county-wide CSA.
For strictly fire.
Fire, and I think I'd have to check whether it's fire and police. It has law enforcement. I don't know whether it's for. I'm pretty sure it's for fire, and I'm not sure whether it's for law enforcement. But there is a county-wide one hasn't not activated.
That is something else I kind of want to look into when we meet too, just to kind of explore that option too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, this probably, you know this all too well, but the typical new development, especially in residential, is that the costs often exceed the revenue, and so what we're talking about is a need for some sustainable long-term funding. Of course, there's always the base ad valorem property tax, which is the quote-unquote 1% that we've been living with since Prop 13 is kind of your baseline. But that's all factored into when you look at the fiscal impact of a new development. You do a fiscal impact analysis. I think this is also pretty telling in that just really gives an idea of what Prop 13 did with local government. If you look at when it passed in 1978, there was a pretty large drop in revenue. Prior to that, a lot of folks, starting to feel like the old guy in the room, don't realize that prior to 1978, cities, counties, special districts, school districts all got together once a year and said, how much money do you need? What's the budget? They laid it all out. What's the assessed value or what's the property value? And they just divided it out. And our tax rate was 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%. And it could just go up, pretty much at will. And so Prop 13 brought it back to the 1% and capped it. So that's why you see that huge drop in revenues for local government, but of course it started going up later on. So what replaced that? And I'll show you in just a second. So prior to 1978, 90% of local revenues were just the base property tax. But then fast forward to now, that base property tax is down to 66%. So a pretty significant shift. What filled the gap? Obviously, there's a bunch of different things: sales taxes, hotel, utility, different fees, rates, and charges. But we're going to focus mostly on these highlighted ones here, the bold ones on the list. Parcel taxes, which a city or county can implement. A CFD, which you're familiar with, which is a different type of a parcel tax at the end of the day. That came about as almost a reaction to Prop 13. The law was brought in 1982, so just a few years later. And then special or benefit assessments have been around for literally over 100 years. There's the 1911 Act, the 13 Act, et cetera, et cetera. So those benefit assessments have been around many years. They're still around. They had some challenges, court challenges and legal challenges in the last few years, but they're still being formed today. And then there's this thing called the property-related fee, which really didn't exist per se until this Prop 218 came in. And it defined a property-related fee, and I'll get into some of that in just a couple minutes here. So that's kind of the background as to why we're having these discussions year in and year out at the local government level. And this is pretty much all I do is work with cities and counties and special districts and such. So the first thing we talk about is, what do we want to fund? What's the need, right? You guys pretty much know what it is. What are your priorities? but talking to your community, your developers, what is it? Is it fire? Is it road maintenance? Is it landscaping? You figure out what those priorities are, and then you choose the revenue tools, right? So again, talking through those things, having the community meetings, having the property owners weigh in, it all comes together to select the revenue tools that we're talking about here, whether it's a parcel tax or an assessment district. It's the same thing, with the operational side. The slide is not coming in right. What are your operational options, right? We have the CSA, which we've talked about, which the CFD, which is another entity that's really just a financial entity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm sorry, I'm going out of order here. The CSD is the Community Services District, which is an independent special district. I know that's been discussed as an option when looking at these developments, whether they're slightly outside of Hollister or where they might be. It's unless you have at least 500 voters, though, in a CSD, a Community Services District, you all would likely be the governing board. In other words, if you formed a new CSD and there's only 100 voters in there, then that's not going to be an independent special district. So definitely some considerations there. Then the last sort of operational option, again, juxtaposed against the financial part of it, is an HOA, which is an independent agency that is not governed, obviously, by you as the Board of Supervisors, but rather, its own board or what have you. What sometimes is happening in certain places in California is they'll allow for an HOA to be formed, but then there'll be a latent CFD, a taxing authority, that if the HOA goes bankrupt, then you can go ahead and activate that CFD so that you're not left holding the bag, so to say. So that brings me to what I started to talk about is what is a CFD? There's actually, it's kind of interesting. It's a financial tool. It's akin to a special assessment district. It's been around since 1982, as I mentioned. But some people, especially in Southern California, talk about it as if it was like a CSA or a CSD, like it has a board and all that. It doesn't. It's nothing in the eyes of the IRS. And it's really not really a subdivision of government. It's not subject to LAFCO or any kind of formation. It's really a tool. Some of the language you read on it makes it sound like it's actually an entity, but it doesn't have a board. It doesn't have any sort of oversight, if you will. It's really a financial tool, just like implementing, a water rate or something. Does that make sense on the operational side? So again, what are the priorities? What are you funding? What are you trying to provide? What type of services do you have? And then which of those operational options make sense? It's a kind of a similar iterative process in that you want to figure out what you're doing, and then which of these things do we pick off the menu, if you will, to do the operational side. So going into the short list here of the tools, I don't know why that's looking like that. So the CFD, again, is a tool that you can use to finance your operations, and it can be for annual maintenance. It can also be for infrastructure. So you can have a CFD, $50 million worth of bonds that finances roads and sewers and water treatment plants and schools and what have you. We're working on a large project out in the Folsom area that's south of Highway 50, if you're familiar with that. It's a massive new project that's using CFD to fund a lot of the infrastructure. But the tension is, if you put so much of your money into the infrastructure side, do you have enough headroom left, if you will, to fund services? So that's a tension that also comes into play when you're looking at these things. You also have a parcel tax, which is very similar to CFD. It just there's the code sections on it are very short and what you can do with it. But a parcel tax is certainly something that should be considered when you're going through the list of options. The special assessment districts, which is what I mentioned, benefit assessments have been around for a long time, 100 years, that fund everything from fire suppression to landscape and lighting to even some flood control and those kinds of things. And then the last is this sort of property-related fee, which is that catch-all that I mentioned. That really was that term was created after Prop 218. That's a fee that requires an analysis, and I'll get into the details in a minute here of sort of the relative rigor. But it has to be property-related, obviously, given the name, and it's a fee that's charged. And the CSAs, as I'll mention in a few minutes here, seems like they have like a little bit more leeway than just a plain old city or county, which is kind of an offshoot of that when the CSA law was rewritten back in 2009. The EIFD, you probably heard a little bit about this. There was kind of a lot of hype when it came into being about a year and a half ago. People thought it was redevelopment all over again. I don't think it really applies here, but I just mentioned it in case folks have heard about it. It's an infrastructure financing district. It has pretty limited uses, and I don't know that it'll be applicable here, but I just kind of wanted to make sure that if there were any questions on that, it is not sort of redevelopment one all over again. Before I keep going on here, I want to really make sure that everybody's clear on this terminology, because again, this stuff gets confusing for everybody, right? You got parcel taxes or special taxes or CFD all live in the tax world, right? It's 2/3 approval still. There's been some discussion of changing those. And it has basically what I would call low rigor in terms of like the analysis of what the benefit is. You can basically come up with a formula that, as long as it makes sense on its face, you can move forward with that new special tax formula. On the other side, the assessments, the benefit assessments, have a very high hurdle to go over in terms of rigor from the assessment engineering standpoint. So you really have to prove that there's benefit to the property before you put in a benefit assessment district. So there's a lot more rigor there than there is with a tax. And the property-related fee kind of lives in the middle. So if a special tax is most flexible and a benefit assessment is least flexible, property-related fee is literally right in the middle. You have to show what's called proportionality, but you don't have to show that it has all this special benefit like you do with a benefit assessment district. And we can just thank all the changes to the Constitution for sort of hamstringing us with these types of terms here. So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper here on these various financial tools. So CFDs and parcel taxes, they're cousins. They don't have to be benefit-based. You don't have to prove that, like I was talking about with assessment districts. You just really need to have some reasonable set of a formula, and you need to achieve what's called the local goals and policies, which I understand you already adopted a couple of years ago. The approval mechanism I mentioned is 2/3 if you're implementing one in a populated area, which is defined as 12 registered voters or more. If it's an unpopulated area, then it becomes a landowner vote, and there's a formula that's basically an acreage mechanism. Again, you have to get to 2/3. And the projects, I sort of alluded to that earlier, that can be done is that you can fund schools, fire stations, open space acquisition. We just did one up in Marin County where they acquired some open space, and everybody in the area agreed to tax themselves 92% yes vote or whatever to buy this piece of property and put it into permanent open space. So it's a very flexible tool, as I mentioned, without all that intense rigor that a benefit assessment has. So here's that opposite. The benefit assessment is very rigorous in terms of the analysis that you have to go through to put in a benefit assessment district. You have to look at the general benefit, take that out, and only assess the special benefit. And there's no sort of one-size-fits-all. It just takes a lot of analysis. They are viable. They're still around. We're still forming many of them. but they're not as easy as they once were some years ago. It's basically a protest ballot, and it's a 50% hurdle as opposed to the 2/3, which you see with the special tax. And it's weighted by assessment. So those who pay more have more of a vote, if you will. And the projects, again, it can really run the gamut. Benefit assessment districts can finance infrastructure. They can finance ongoing services. So this property-related fee that I mentioned, which is right in the middle of the tax and assessment, it does require that proportionality that I mentioned. So there is some rigor to it. You can't just sort of, throw out a formula that doesn't have that proportionality. And where this comes out, the example that I like to use is like storm drain. If a property has no impervious surface versus the one that's pervious, there's a difference, obviously, in what's going on with that property, so you're going to charge accordingly. There is a ballot process for that. And example, as you all well know, is the CSAs that you have around here. And there are a few storm drain property-related fees that are in municipalities. Now, the other fees, rates, and charges, not going to spend much time on this, but you know what types of fees and rates that you charge as a county. But the reason that I threw this in here for discussion is that the new CSA law talks very specifically about what a CSA, what are sort of the tools in a CSA's toolbox. And one of them is its own sort of fees and charges. So, they're basically a voluntary thing. We're talking like building permit or inspection or, these types of things. I know you're not supposed to do this when you're doing a PowerPoint, put too many words on a slide, but I put this in for effect because the new CSA law that, again, I mentioned it was cleaned up in 2009, and you can read this in your packet. I'm not going to read all these, allows you literally to provide from A to Z services. Everything from fire suppression to television, cable, water, stormwater, vector control, street lighting, landscaping, geologic hazards, flood control. The list goes on, literally, to Z.
So,
Abatement of graffiti and weeds and
I got
rubbish.
a quick question.
Yes.
I was always under the impression that a CSA was meant like for landscaping, lights and fixing the resurfacing the roads. Number one up there, or A, was sheriff services, and I don't think. Do we have any CSAs that has a sheriff?
No.
Doesn't.
But, we have that one inactive one, and we'll have to go back and check to see whether it's law enforcement and fire or whether it's fire.
Maybe
We did have one that
Supervisor
was
Vitello's right.
inactive.
We should look into it.
We should look into it and just, it's a possible option for a revenue stream to address a need.
So this A to Z list is everything that a CSA can provide. It's not must provide. Right. So you could literally have a CSA that only does one, fire, or you could have one that does A to Z. And then obviously if you're providing those services, if they're property related, and sheriff is obviously, that's a very debatable one. But if maintaining roads to get to the property obviously is a property related fee, otherwise there's no other way in and out of the property, there's clearly a value there. There's clearly a nexus. So just to recap then, a CSA can levy all of these types of things. So the property-related fees for the services that it is providing. It can also have benefit assessments. It can do parcel taxes, but curiously, the law doesn't say that a CSA can use a CFD as a financing tool. So that's a little bit of an odd thing that not sure why that was left out, but it was. And then obviously the other fees and charges that I mentioned. So a CSA can have, it doesn't have to, can have like an oversight board that provides input, like a community, type arrangement. Lots of different bells and whistles, if you will, for the CSA. So this sort of financing 101, we spend a whole day going through this, and we've spent here 20 minutes or so. So obviously a lot of information. I know we're going to have time for question and answers, but the options that I wanted to just throw up for discussion, and these are not like firm recommendations because we haven't done a study or what have you, but just had some conversations with some of the folks here, is that if the county wants to continue providing the operations, you could certainly continue with a CSA, or you can go do CFD, which I understand you've done the first one here, but the CFD or a CSA still points back to the board would be the oversight board, so you would still have the operational authority and wherewithal to manage them. If the thought is to have another entity that's closer physically or what have you to these developments, then obviously an HOA is an option. And as I mentioned a little earlier, to have that backstop of a CFD is certainly not a bad idea in sort of risk management, if you want to call it that. The other is to form a community services district, which is an independent special district if you have 500 voters or more. If you formed a CSD, as I mentioned earlier on, with only, say, 100 voters, then the way I understand the law and the LAFCO is that the authority would still revert back to you as the Board of Supervisors to be the oversight, if you will, for a community services district. So there's some scaling there that would certainly need to be discussed. This is sort of just additional resources that might be helpful to you or whoever is sort of following this. Is the League of Cities has a municipal revenue handbook which goes through all these revenue tools that I mentioned. I brought 10 copies of what we call our primer on special financing districts, which is all of those property-based type things. So 5 for you and 5 for the audience, and we can get more if we need to. And then both the League of Cities and the Special Districts Association has a Prop 218 implementation guide, which are excellent, written by a couple of attorneys who really specializes in Prop 218 and Prop 26 and that kind of thing. And then that chart that I showed earlier on, the Prop 13, is a fairly recent report that the Legislative Analyst's Office brought out about common claims about Prop 13 that's pretty interesting. Sort of solidifies some things we've heard, but also breaks a few myths that we've heard about Prop 13 as well. So interesting reading if you're into that wonky property tax stuff. With that, I think we're going to have questions, unless Barbara or Nadia or anybody had anything else to mention.
Yeah, all right.
Questions?
Thank you. Supervisor Medina?
Yes, just looking at these, I would, correct me if I'm wrong, please. The less attractive one would be an HOA, simply because there's no skin in the game. If someone doesn't pay their dues, there's nothing, without a CFD backup, there's nothing they can do. They can lien the house, but until...
Everybody hear me okay? Yeah, so HOA is a private entity, so we've seen them go bust. So yeah, without some kind of backup, an HOA I think is probably not the most generally the most prudent thing to do. Obviously, you can require some maybe cash reserves or other ways of sort of ensuring that the HOA will endure, but that's certainly a question.
Thank you. Supervisor Patella?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems we have is just the overall administration of services. It's not so much within the development itself as much as, everybody, the parks and roads that everybody uses, the tax office that everybody uses, and so forth. What is the and CSAs kind of are more focused on, the development itself and and we've been trying to go to the community finance districts to help with the more global realm of services, and some money's going to that. Is that still the best option as far as addressing what the areas that we're short on because of Prop 13 and so forth?
Yeah, when we're looking at a CSA versus a CFD, they're very similar. A CFD, actually, there's a list of the specific services that a CFD can provide, and it's all in the statute. And that list is a little shorter than that A to Z list for the CSA. So on one hand, the CSA, I think, provides for maybe a couple more services. And I'm thinking some of them are somewhat obscure, like cable TV and some of these other things that a CFD would never, it doesn't enter into the realm of normal taxation law, I guess. So there's a few other services that a CSA provides versus a CFD. The CFD is a tax, so it's not subject so much to the rigor of the proportionality that a CSA property-related fee would be. So there's kind of, there are a little bit of apples and oranges, and there's a couple of pros and cons for each one, frankly.
Yeah, and prior boards with prior developments went more with a CSA, and there's not two CSAs in our list of about 30 of them that are the same. Mm-hmm. And now we're looking at more CFDs so we could address police and fire and animal control, things that people that move to a community expect to have.
Sure.
But the amount of tax revenue that the unincorporated San Diego County gets, it's impossible to provide. And so we're trying to catch up with new development. Earlier today, we had a project that went through the process, got approved, and it was a small project. It wasn't big. At what point? And
right, yeah.
If my feeling is that we need to, if you pull a permit, you just got to anticipate having that extra fee on top of your property taxes year in, year out. But I think our staff had been working under the assumption that you should be a certain size before we go through this trouble of setting up a CFD. Now, what is that threshold, and why couldn't we just do a whole blanket policy of expecting this additional surcharge?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about a client of ours is the city of Vacaville, which they're not a county, so they actually don't have access to the CSA. So their options are actually a little more limited than yours. But for the last 10 years at least, we've been forming new CFDs for public safety. And a lot of the subdivisions are quite large. There are 500 homes, 1,000 homes or better. But then a couple of years ago, we formed like an inner Vacaville, if you want to call it, CFD that picks up some of the smaller infill development. And then properties basically just annex into that infill CFD. So they have, 10 maybe public safety CFDs. Most of them are kind of out more of the suburban area, if you will, versus this one that's intended to do kind of the core and pick up the smaller development. So that's certainly another possibility, what's called a core annexable CFD, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, because it's just so bad here. I think we either figure out how we fix this revenue problem, or we don't issue any more permits.
Right,
it's
yes.
getting right down to that.
So what you're saying is you develop a blanket per se on a funding mechanism for sheriff and fire. And if it's small individuals, then you might almost have like a whole little pocket by itself.
Right. I mean, if there's a way to streamline some of that to where you literally would just have a bit of a standard that you use, you might be able to get it down to more of an application system, or that it's more cost effective for somebody who's doing a dozen homes to just, come into that CFD without going
Yeah.
through the LAFCO process and all that kind of thing.
Right.
And when you're setting up the CFD, like let's say you just had a county-wide CFD that individual small subdivisions could annex into, I presume that you have to do some sort of CEQA process, whether it's an exemption, because maybe you could say that, there's no development being formed as the formation of the CSD because it's revenue, just a source of revenue. Did you make that finding when you're approving it, perhaps to have just an exemption on the formation of the CFD itself?
Tim, I don't know if you've seen this, but we often see jurisdictions.
Oh, yeah.
Can you?
Like it's on, but, oh, there we
Right
go.
now. Is that better?
Can you hear?
Red light is
No.
on.
Can you
Battery is dead. Here, use this.
Hello?
There you go.
Not really.
No.
it's
Would you
still
try
not
this
on.
one?
Switching to Tim's. How's
There you
that?
go.
Better.
All right. Tim, I don't know what you've seen, but certainly in other jurisdictions where I've seen a broader CFD process, you don't typically see the jurisdictions treat that as a discretionary process that triggers CEQA, because you're merely adopting a financing. You're forming a financing district or adopting a particular financing mechanism. So as long as it's separate and apart from the project otherwise being approved, I think we would be okay. But have you seen anybody ever go through a CEQA process?
No, it's typically not required because it's really a financing tool.
Right. Exactly. So you're not otherwising facilitating development. The one thing I will throw out there is we're talking about sort of these broader CFDs, and I know we've dealt with this in other jurisdictions, and I'm sure Tim has a ton of experience with it. It becomes a bit of a balance because we have a jurisdiction like this county who's had long time revenue generation issues. And remember that the CFD is only going to be imposed on developments moving forward. So there's always a balance between development paying for itself, obviously, which is always the intention, and making sure that there are sufficient services. And in all of the larger projects where a CFD or similar mechanism has been applied in the project, we've been very clear that that mechanism is designed to ensure revenue neutrality. But we haven't used the CFD to offset, so the new development is making up for past failures of existing lands not paying sufficient revenue. So it's a balance for sure.
Well, I mean, I
I
don't know how the board feels, but I don't think we should penalize new development for all development. I don't think so. Ray?
No, I was just going to say that, but we need to start somewhere. We need to move forward with doing something. The longer we wait, the deeper the hole gets. So,
Yeah.
I wonder, because this is a question that's often brought up. Tim, could you talk a bit more about sort of the formation process for a CFD and why typically you would do maybe a core services CFD for smaller projects to annex into, as opposed to having every project create its own CFD?
So the process of a CFD, if you don't have registered voters, which is what I mentioned, that's an important distinction. So if it's raw land, somebody owns it, the owner can waive a number of steps. And so they basically sign a ballot that says they agree, and then you can form a district. There's a lot of machinations that go into figuring out, how to make the district work, its structure, and then importantly, the numbers. What is the tax per year going to be on a house? And there's a lot of work to do that. So if you have to do that each and every time you have 6 homes, that's cost prohibitive.
But can we
So
do something like a program, EIR, something like that?
Well, if you can get folks to agree to a number, then you could have kind of almost a more of a streamlined annexation where, you can come in and it's more or less it's a formula, and then really there's only a few things that you have to do. There is still some startup costs. It's not free, right? You still have to have a hearing. You still have to record documents with the county recorder. There's still some administrative things, but it's a lot less work than, you have to go out and do a brand new special tax report, and you've got to go through legal docs, and you've got to do all these various things to put together the CFD. So you can set it up move more streamlined is what I'm trying to say.
So once, maybe, sorry about this, Mark. So once we have something in place, does it require a vote every 5 years or every 6 years?
A CFD, you can put a CFD in perpetuity.
Okay, that was my
and
question.
You don't need a vote.
Thank you. Supervisor Medina?
I mean, you don't need a second vote. You need a first vote.
One quick question is there a difference between a city CFD and a county CFD?
I couldn't quite...
A city CFD or a county CFD, it's the same thing, correct?
They are basically, yeah, there's a CFD law that's in the state statute in the government code. Some cities have adopted the CFD law if they're a charter city, and they've tweaked it maybe a little bit for their particular needs. But I think if what you're asking is kind of just a more generic question,
exactly.
Then it's one and the same.
And the reason I ask that is because we don't need to create this out of thin air. The city of Hollister has CFDs. So it would behoove us to maybe create a little ad hoc committee and possibly partner with City of Hollister and ask them what they're doing to see if we can do something similar.
That's an idea. Are you done, Mark?
Yes.
Supervisor Munzer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So CFDs, you say they need their initial vote to form them. And then how do the fees keep up with the expenses of the district? Is there a COLA, automatic COLA?
Yes, you can have a COLA. You don't have to, but yes, what gets approved, what a property owner would then assign a ballot for to approve, would be the max tax. So let's just say, for simplicity, that a property owner approves $100 per year with a CPI of 2% a year. So that establishes the maximum. So the next year, the maximum is $102. You can kind of set that on autopilot to just keep going with 2% a year, although the board could levy annually something less than the maximum. For whatever reason, sometimes this happen, like we'll only levy at 50% or something like that. But what gets approved by that ballot is the maximum with an optional inflator. So it's not something that has to be approved each and every year if it's on a normal track, like it's the Northern California CPI. It just goes up every year.
Okay. So my frustration with the CSAs is we have them in place. We have used a mix of contracted people to come in, perform the services, and county staff. And I not so much jokingly say that if a street light goes out in a CSA, it takes 20 county employees to get that street light changed. Mm-hmm. Just the whole process of going out for RFPs, proving contracts, and it's a long process. And the community gets frustrated with the perceived lack of services. Mm-hmm. So then when it comes back around to the 218 process, voting for increased fees, they're so frustrated they vote themselves out. And that's why when Barbara put those maps up, we have so many inactive. CSAs because they got frustrated with us. Any sense of how other counties handles that?
Well, the operational part of it is not going to go away even with the CFD. I mean, you're still either going to have to use a combination of county staff and contracted staff, or some different mix thereof. So the operational part's not going to go away. What is a little different is that annual COLA. What we've seen, though, in some places is that the COLA is just not significant enough. So it
doesn't keep for a CFD. It does not keep up.
Right. I mean, it depends on sort of what track the costs are on. If you're buying gasoline, right? Gasoline may go up, it may go down, it may skyrocket if there's another oil crisis or something, and you just can't. You can't really pinpoint that. So that's the operational part is always going to be a challenge. With the CSA, I think if you set it up with a COLA to begin with, I think you would have, less of that issue.
But I thought the COLA was maxed out after something like 5 years.
For the fee, we were told when we did the fee report that we had a maximum 5-year for the COLA for the fee. Maybe it's different from the CSA, but that's what we were told when we formed our fee reports 5 years ago, that we could only do the COLA escalation for 5 years after the adoption of the fee.
I know we're looking into that. I'll have to circle back on that.
So I got a quick question. On a CFD, that's forever, right?
It can be, yes. It can be set up to go into perpetuity.
This body's saying, yeah, we're going to make sure it goes forever. On a CSA, we have to go to a 218 every 5 years, correct?
If you wanted, that was what we were told in 2009.
Okay, so let's assume we're still in the same parameters.
If you want,
So if we're providing sheriff and fire protection to the CSA, and then in 5 years they voted down, do we have to continue to provide those services?
how we've done it before is that the base fee would continue in perpetuity forever, but it's just the COLA that we weren't continuing after the 5 years, but we always have the base fee.
Okay. If worse comes to worse, I'm willing to absorb the COLA because right now we're just going like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how the rest of the board members feel, but if worse comes to worse, I'm okay with that. I want some type of funding mechanism.
What if you determine an area and create that as a CFD? You know, we identify certain services and what the cost is going to be with the projected growth, and that's the area, and whatever building permit that takes place would be obligated to pay that CFD.
Mm-hmm.
You could do that, can't you?
Yes, yeah, you can have a trigger as a building permit or certificate of occupancy or
Right.
what have you.
See, I think that's something that we're asking the larger developments as they're being approved to have CFDs. I think we did it for a couple of them already, and but it's the smaller developments that need to, pay their share too, and that we're not catching. And in this way, it automatically is done, and you go through it has to go through the LAFCO process one time, or it doesn't.
No,
CFD?
we don't.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
So, what's the difficulty of doing that? And
Yeah, I mean, that's the flexibility of CFDs certainly have made them pretty popular.
I think that's what we have to do because we have to address some of the just general government.
Tim, is there? I wonder to Supervisor Patello's point, because we do have some of these smaller projects where perhaps the improvements at issue are a couple of internal roads and some storm drain improvements, so fairly nominal. And there isn't necessarily an incentive on the county because remember, all of these, Tim, tell me if this isn't correct, but all of these improvements that are covered by the CFD are public improvements. And so to the extent that the improvements haven't been accepted by the county has no maintenance obligations. So you have, like I said, the internal in-track roads, a detention basin, a little tot lot, something like that. All the private parks that remain developer responsibility. And what I'm wondering is if we wanted to talk a little bit more is to the extent that the county does not at this time want to accept certain improvements, if we would want to do something like the HOA with the CFD backup, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about how that works, because we can structure conditions of approval to contemplate both of those options.
Well, that's not what I'm talking about,
Okay.
Nadia. What I'm talking about, putting a fireman on a fire truck. And I'm a builder. In fact, I got a parcel. I could put a house on tomorrow. And I get my permit from the county, and and lo and behold, I have another. We have another house with people in it, and the bigger developments are doing the CFDs. I'm not doing it. I think I should be paying a CFD as well as the other growth, that the larger growth developments. It's for off-site costs that we're incurring. That's what's breaking our backs.
Right, exactly. And so so let's maybe, if we make it concrete, if we have a 10-unit development, say, and we have a road, an in-track road, a tot lot, and then fire services, could we have an HOA, and typically county council would review the relevant CCNRs so that they appropriately covered what we wanted it to cover, and the CCNRs could not be changed without county's consent. We have an HOA, and that HOA is required to maintain the in-track road, maintain the private park, which the county does not want to take on right now. But then in addition, you would be paying the CFD portion, the relevant CFD portion for purposes of fire, et cetera. And then you would also have a CFD backup, in essence. So if that HOA imploded and the county ultimately came in and wanted to take over the road and the tot lot, those become public improvements. The CFD funding would be in place so it could also drop into those improvements. Is that possible, Tim?
It's certainly, yes. It's kind of a unique thing. We have to think about it a little bit. You can always have overlapping CFDs. You can have 2 or 3 on a property. I don't know if we could have it like a latent power within one CFD. You have to think about just the machinations of that, but it's certainly theoretically possible, yes.
Interesting.
If I think that maybe an action item for the board is maybe we should determine a price quote and bring back like a proposal for the board about what it would take and what the timeline would be to form a countywide CFD that we could use for various purposes, and bring it back to the board in a more concrete fashion. Like, this is what we would do if we wanted to form a CFD for like general, law enforcement and fire, et cetera. And this is what we would do. Maybe there'd be two CFDs, one for general government, fire and law enforcement, and one for project specific that wouldn't be active really unless the HOA, either if the board declined to require an HOA for a specific subdivision for any reason, or if the HOA, became non-operational, then that could be for those project specific. But if the board would like, we could go get a specific kind of plan of action and bring it back to the board too, because I sense that the board's going to want to look into the CFD option as a way of going forward, either just for general, to have it for like general governmental services, and also to be a backdrop for the HOAs.
Barbara, I know we talked about it earlier. These projects that are grandfathered, if we're going to go in this direction, we could implement this on these. No.
Not the ones that have already been approved for the tentative maps.
Well, in tentative maps, but wait a minute. If we approve a tentative map, it's not a grandfather, because it's already beyond that line, right?
Right. Those are already. Well, those would be the ones that are already kind of in the. They've already been established as far as what the project needs to comply with as far as conditions of approval. You're talking about future ones that would come to the Planning Commission that we would impose this upon.
Well, then maybe we should tell the Planning Commission not to meet until we set something in place.
The other option to make sure that nobody else gets through while the board is making these decisions is we could work together and craft some condition that RMA is comfortable with, that basically says for any projects in the pipeline, to the extent you're going to get a map approved or a building, whatever approvals you're going forward at this time, where there's an opportunity for the county to condition that approval, we can have a standard, and that's been part of the problem. There haven't been standard conditions dealing with these issues sort of historically. So there's been kind of differing treatment based on the subdivision at issue and the timing, et cetera. We could have a standard condition that contemplates a variety of issues. And I've done this in a number of communities where there's been an ongoing funding discussion. The jurisdiction did not know exactly what it was going to do. It wanted things to keep moving forward, but it didn't want projects to slip through. So you basically say, you shall do X. For example, at this time, do an HOA, except to the extent the county has a CFD in place at this time, in which case you shall agree to join the CFD, et cetera. So you have that legal hook now, but it contemplates a couple of different options. And we could craft some language and then make sure that gets imposed consistently on all the maps that come through prior to when action is taken.
Well, as long as they agree to without prejudice.
Yeah, and this would be it would be not a condition that was trying to extract anything more than the county would legally be able to require in any event.
Yeah, because I don't want them to be under protest and then that money becomes gray money.
Absolutely.
Supervisor?
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea. We should do that right away because it really has no effect on the builders. For instance, today's project, they're build those houses. They're sell them, and it's the new people coming in that they're pay the taxes, not them, and so I don't see why we would catch any flack for that because and then if you're in a bigger development, you're to pay HOA fees anyway. You're paying more money because you have all the things that a large development has, and this is something we've been kind of asking for some time, and we just got to catch this. And I think that's the way we should go forward.
Okay.
Just one quick clarification question. So we form a countywide CFD with the premise that any new house would have to agree to join the CFD, as opposed to forming a CFD and going to the voters that are already in homes, asking them to vote to join the CFD. Correct? We can do this thing where it's just kind of out there initially with no
I think that's
members or homes or whatever, and then as new construction is done, projects or whatever, they are required to join the CFD.
Right, and Tim could speak to this more, but unless you have a community who's willing to tax itself, you see that with school parcel taxes, et cetera, but it is otherwise much more difficult to do an expansive CFD on existing property owners.
Okay.
They're wading into some deep water here at the moment. There's been some legal question in the last year or two about the whole future annexation area where you kind of cast a net over your county and then people come into it. We'd have to do a little bit of homework on that. But essentially, you would have the first development could be your first formation, and then you annex into it. So your first 10 homes is the first one, and then the next 10 join it, and then the next 10 join it, and the next. So there's two ways in the front door, and the one I'm not sure if it's blocked.
Okay, so and again, I don't know if you're just using an example. So you're saying the next 10. I'm assuming you're talking about
New development.
Now, what about the single home?
That's a good question. I don't know. Is that you're talking about conditioning? Then somebody has a 5-acre parcel and then they want to get a building permit, then they would need to annex in.
They have to be in it.
Yeah.
They have to be.
Well, I'm not sure whether it'd be actually triggered by discretionary action. So it'd be like maybe a parcel division or not even clarify with that, because if you just have an existing land and you just need to pull a building permit, there may not be a discretionary. I'll clarify. Maybe Nadia could talk about whether we had to have a certain type of approval before we could put the CFD into place.
Yeah, I think we'd have to look a bit more. I think you certainly would need to think about if you wanted to basically require this on a per building permit basis if there were no other discretionary approvals. So, a building permit is ministerial, which means the county does not have the discretion to deny it if all of the objective criteria are met.
Well, that's going to be one of them.
Right. And so we would have to think about from a county code perspective whether your code would have to be modified to reflect that requirement. And then we'd also have to look at, because the other piece of it obviously is you typically, in order to condition any approval, there also has to be a nexus in many respects. So we'd have to, I think, Barbara, we'd want to look a little bit more at that issue. And assuming that otherwise legally we could go ahead and do it, I think we'd probably have to update your code to reflect that additional requirement. So I think there'd be a couple of steps that you would need to take if you were outside of the context of a discretionary approval process. But certainly when you're talking about subdivision of land, there's always conditions that are imposed, and this is quite typical to the supervisor's point. Most communities now are dealing with exactly the same issue, and there is this notion of development paying its own way, and that there has to be a provision of services. And again, as long as developers tend to be reactive, if that assessment or that special tax is going to be extraordinary, which it impacts the marketability of the property. But otherwise, oftentimes, we have a lot of developers who actually like this because it does provide for a higher quality of, ongoing landscaping, road improvements that can be beneficial for the maintenance of the project overall. So there can certainly be some synergies between the development community and the broader county in trying to work out something that works. And I know, and Tim, I'm sure, has a lot of examples in this regard where we work in communities and there's a specific sewer need or something, and the development community comes together as stakeholders and they figure out what actually is going to make sense going forward. So,
okay, if there's any more questions, I'd like to open up to the public. Okay. You have any speaker cards? Not anybody from the public?
It's right there.
Yes, Carson Clower, resident of Hollister. I know our little project came up earlier and it continues to come up. One of the main things that I've saw through the process was that the Board of Supervisors sets the policy and then the staff is going to set the conditions for the project. And that was one of the things that we found out early, was that when you had a condition, they were going to follow it to a T for what the Planning Commission approved. And one of our conditions that was approved was that we would have an HOA or some other form of funding mechanism that would be approved by the Board of Supervisors for the road maintenance. And that we got hung up on that for probably 2 to 3 months. And I appreciate County Council and staff working through it with us. But that was a big deal because we do have a road that it's going to be a private road because the county has said they're not going to accept it at this point, but it's public use, used by lots of other people. So one of the things that we'd be open to doing is looking at joining a CFD, which is something that's been discussed behind the scenes in the last couple months, so that would be taken care of. And if you guys get extra funding for your sheriff's department, for fire, whatever, that would be great. I think that's a win-win for everybody. So we'd be open to looking at that. But really, it comes down to those conditions that are put in play. And I know that there's other people out there that are kind of struggling through the same thing. Hopefully, with our HOA situation, we've got it solved for the near term, but hopefully there's a better option going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? No one else? I'll bring it back. Okay, well, I think we got some good information here. I like your ideas, Barbara. I think we should move this ASAP. The sooner the better. I don't want to discuss another small project, 3-4 units, and Supervisor Botello's, hounding them down because there's not a funding mechanism in place. So we want this ASAP. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I also think, too, I think we need to internally, staff needs to look at policies in the Planning Commission as well as what the board decides, as well as development agreements, too, and what trigger points that staff need to go. So what size project is a project that we want to look at a development agreement? What does the board want on the development agreement? I think we need to really scrutinize that when we're in this process because it's kind of like we've been talking about. Each project's a little bit different. I know that there's, not one size fits all, but I think at least having kind of a checklist or having some sort of, kind of list that we go off of, and if there's any other things, then we can talk to the board about that. But I think that's important as well.
I think your ideas are good because it'll add flexibility. But at the end of the day, the end results is that either from a fiscal perspective, it's neutral or better in the county side. Absolutely. Supervisor Rivas?
Right, yeah. So after this whole discussion we've had, my head is like spinning, right? Because this is messy. It's not, we've mowed through these planning and public works directors. And I think this has a lot to do with it. There's so much confusion in the community. And if we don't get it right up here, we're never going to get it right. Because obviously if there was an easy a solution, we would have found it by now. But certainly we just talked earlier about professionalizing public works and planning. So we've got some high-priced consultants in there. And I think this is how we begin that process. And certainly we need to establish some kind of standards of these conditions that apply to everybody. Because right now we're all over the map, whether you're in the process, whether you're about to begin that process. Certainly things that are happening at the Planning Commission that, although they are an advisory board to this Board of Supervisors, certainly there's been a breakdown somewhere along the lines. And so we certainly have to correct this as soon as possible. So I hope next time we have this agenda item, we could have some substance as far as some actions that we can take as a board. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Supervisors, for your comments. Thank you. Supervisor Munzer?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think actually our CAO probably said it best. This is just a start of the process because we have to, at some point, determine if we go a countywide CFD and everybody is every new house is included in that. We have to determine at what point a large development needs to go beyond the CFD and the requirement of the CFD. And I think that's what Ray was alluding to. I think that's very important. And, is that a major subdivision, which is 5 houses? Or is that the defunct Del Webb, Santana Ranch, 1,000 homes? We need to determine when that gets kicked in and benefits beyond the all-inclusive CDF or CFD, I'm sorry, is required. So we have a lot of discussions to do and a lot of decisions to make.
Ray, I know the planning department is here. Does the planning commission, are they having projects before them anytime soon? Oh, Larry, Jim, I don't know. James. Oh, it's easy to remember. It's easy.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the board. James Walgren, Interim RMA Director. We do have a Planning Commission meeting next week. I've so far only attended one since I've been here. There isn't a large backload waiting to get on their agenda. In fact, next week's discussion is more on coordinating with the other cities' planning commissions and talking about land use policies. But we do have projects in the pipeline that I'm really just getting up to speed on that will be coming to the Planning Commission, but not in the immediate future.
The board doesn't really want to delay these projects. I mean, we want to give that message out to the community. We don't want to delay them. But if they can sign a waiver or add-on that there's fees are going to come around the corner and they understand they're going to pay, can we do that? And I guess that's more for legal counsel. Nadia?
Well, I think the recommendation to have that general HOA, perhaps CFD in the future condition, that'll work. And none of these projects are going to be going to the Planning Commission immediately. It'll be probably over the next couple of months that we start seeing these projects get agendized. But I think a general condition like that would work fine.
Is that okay with the board members? Supervisor Batella?
Yeah, in fact, I had lunch with James yesterday. I mentioned that my head was chewed off by a builder about his project. And I don't want to hold up anybody's project either, but I really think we have to treat everybody fairly and and equally, we have some big developments that already agreed to CFDs. Santana Ranch has a CFD, I think, in place. And I think it should pertain to the smaller developers, or even one. In my case, I would say even a one house developer. We have the cost is the same, and we should have some numbers that reflect a shortfall with sheriffs, jail, fire, roads. It's not right that I think the Clowers in their situation. Maintaining a road that's being used by the public. Now, if that was a gated community, they should take care of their own road. But I have a couple of roads like that in my district, and it just leads to a problem. It's going to lead to a problem one of these days with the future residents there, and that's not how we should be addressing it. I'd rather see us address it through a CFD, and so the chairman's right. New growth is not a catch up with our deficit that we have now. I just don't want to see us fall further and further behind. How we catch up is with other economic development, with the business license fee, development on commercial corridors on our highways and things like that. That's where we catch up on the stuff that we've fallen behind on. But going forward, I think we have to have that condition in place with all the new permits, and everybody understands the rules. And that's a big problem, is that the rules kind of change with new directors and new planning folks in the office, and it's wrong. And I could understand the frustration out there.
Well said, Supervisor Patel.
Thank you.
Okay, so you guys got direction? Do we need to?
That's fine.
All right, thank you, Nadia. Thank you. James, Ray, Barbara. Okay, let's move on to number 22. Discussion whether San Benito County should pursue forming a groundwater sustainability agency.
We have the San Benito County Water District that came. Would you like to start with a presentation, then I do a presentation, or do you want me to start?
Either way, Barbara.
Okay. Yeah. Either way.
You want us to go first?
Yeah, you can, and then I can just fill in a little bit more.
Thank you.
I think it's loaded. Sure. Okay. Yeah, but his PowerPoint, I was just going to skip over some of my stuff. But I can actually, why don't I do a little bit of an intro, and then he can do a presentation, and I can fill in any extra slides. I can give a background of why we put the thing together.
Tim, are you leaving your little booklets?
Yeah, can you give us? Yeah, definitely. Give it to Chase.
Yes.
Yeah, give it to Chase. Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Agency Act was enacted by legislature, and normally we would have an entity would have until June 30th to form a groundwater sustainability agency, and the San Benito County Water District did elect in February to become the groundwater sustainability agency for 3 of the basins within San Benito County that need to have a GSA formed for them. That starts a 90-day time period for the San Benito County to act. So we did schedule a public hearing on May 23rd, and then we bring this for the first look from the board on today's date, so the board can understand this law and determine what it would like to do in regard to this law. There's options laid out in the staff report, and in one hand that the GSA can be formed by an entity by itself. There's also other mechanisms to form the GSA. They can be formed through a JPA or an MOU with other entities. So in this case, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that the county form a GSA and act solely on exclusively on its own behalf. There is a lot of time and staff time that would be necessary to form a GSA, and also has costs associated with it that can be collected via fees or grant funding. But it does require some technical abilities. We have not historically performed water management in the county. It's been with the San Bernardino County Water District. Part of the reason, though, I did want to bring this to the board is because if the county does not act, then it loses the ability to get involved with the issue, because the San Bernardino County Water District would be the GSA for the county. So the board can choose to be, if it chose to do so on May 23rd, it could choose to adopt the resolution and file to become a GSA, and then enter into negotiations with the water district to determine how that should best be accomplished. So, for example, you could form a JPA where maybe 3 members of the water district were governing or board members for the JPA, and then maybe 2 members of the county, or you could have an MOU with the water district if they were so inclined, where the county delegates authority to the water district to act for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, et cetera, but still retains the right to bring that back to the county if there's any issues in the future. We did have a discussion with the San Bernardino County Water District yesterday. I know that they're here to present, and I wanted to thank them for doing the presentation today, that they have had this function. They have had the function of managing groundwater within the county. I spent last night, and I've been reviewing the law between their governing law and then also this new law. And from my perspective, although they do have that function, it seems like the new law is a little bit more robust, and you also don't know how it will be amended in the future. So that by not acting at this point in time, the county does. I wanted to make sure the county understands that is going to be handled by the San Bernardino County Water District, and that you don't necessarily have that ability to get involved in the future. So that's going to be a delegation of that authority. So it is like a decision that the board has to make today. So let me go ahead and have you do a presentation. Yeah. And then I just have a few extra slides, but I think that pretty much most of the points, or some of them, are very similar. This one?
All right, good afternoon. Jeff Catania, General Manager for San Benito County Water District. I've got Iris Priestaff from Todd Groundwater here today. She's going to give you kind of an overview from the state perspective and what other agencies are doing. And then I'm going to kind of step back and tell you what the Water District's been doing for the last 100 years, and then what we plan on doing in the future. So, and then after that, if you have any questions, we can answer those and let you know what the district's perspective is. So, Iris, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Jeff. So, by way of introduction, I'm Iris Priestaff. I'm president of Todd Groundwater, and we are a company that specializes in groundwater management. We've been doing that for almost 40 years. And I'm here as a consultant to the San Benito County Water District. But I would like to point out, since I have the podium, that I have had the opportunity to work for other agencies in this county and landowners, and for the county. And in fact, Todd Groundwater worked on some of the initial studies for your general plan update. So with that, I've been involved in groundwater management.
You may not want to use the general plan as
Yeah.
This is full disclosure.
Okay.
We'll forgive you this time.
Thank you. It was a background report. But anyhow, we have worked in groundwater basin management for many, many years, and I've actually had the opportunity to be involved in the development of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I mean, this act has been in development for years. When the whole state recognized that overdraft in some basins is not going away, and it's not sustainable, and something needs to be done. So water agencies, the state, scientific communities, cities and county land use planning agencies came together and hammered on this law, which was signed by the governor in 2014 and became law in 2015. Since that time, It's developed further. It's still evolving very rapidly. We've never done this before, and so we're all learning how to do it. So just very, very briefly about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It really is landmark legislation. This is legislation like has not happened in 100 years in California. So you can imagine we're all working on it very hard. And what it does is it provides a framework for sustainable management of groundwater. And this is applicable to certain groundwater basins in the state. There are actually 517 groundwater basins in the state of California, and of these, about 127 have been deemed medium and high priority by the state. So this is a framework to manage these for sustainability, no more overdraft, and the idea was local control, that there would be management by local agencies. So the state is going to be involved. And at this point, the role of the Department of Water Resources so far has been supportive with data, techniques, information, and such as that. Later, they will be regulators. And then there's also a role for state intervention, which comes from the State Water Resources Control Board. This is new regulation. It is a law that has deadlines and requirements. It has, 57 pages and is in Sigma. And then that didn't explain it well enough. So in the regulations to do these groundwater sustainability plans, they had to come out with another 40. So there's a lot of reading to be done here. But if this is not done properly, then the state can step in, declare a groundwater basin in probation, and then, they will come and assist you towards sustainability. So first of all, the basics are that local groundwater sustainability agents, GSAs, must be formed, and they must cover the groundwater basins that are high and medium priority. And then those GSAs must prepare groundwater sustainability plans. And Jeff will say a little bit about the deadlines, that there's hard and fast deadlines here. But one of the things that I've noted is I've worked with Sigma over the years is there's considerable appreciation of the roles of water agencies and land use planning agencies. So I wanted to put this quote up from the regulations, Chapter 5, and I've condensed it a little bit. I'm not an attorney. I'm a practitioner. I'm down in the weeds trying to figure out how to do this thing. But it does say nothing in this chapter or a groundwater sustainability plan shall be interpreted as superseding the land use authority of cities and counties, including the city or county general plan within the overlying basin. So that's about as clear as a statement as you can get, I think, in California law. So as I've studied how groundwater sustainability plans are going to be developed, how entities will come together, put these things together, submit them to the Department of Water Resources for evaluation. One of the things that I've really noted is that there is a lot of coordination between the GSA, which was accurately described as it can be one agency or several agencies coming together with a MOU or a JPA. But as they put together these GSPs, there is basically coordination with the land use planners from the very beginning to the very end. And so there's going to be coordination with land use agencies. It's written in the law. The GSP must summarize the general plans. And I've already had the opportunity to do that for some GSPs, where you really do need to dig in there and see, what are the policies, what are the goals, what are the programs and projects that you all have that might affect water management? And that's the next thing. We need to describe how a groundwater sustainability plan might affect a general plan, and vice versa, because clearly there are connections there. Then a GSP must document land uses and land use plans for the water budget analysis, which is really, we're talking about sustainable yield of groundwater, having enough water in the water budget for future generations. We need to look at the land use plans in terms of the water budget. And then there's going to need to be a description of how the sustainable management criteria, how are we going to operate a groundwater basin? How is that going to affect land uses and property owners? So, it's also true, as has been mentioned before, that groundwater sustainability agencies have additional powers and authorities, and there's a long list of them, and I am certainly not going to put them all up here, but I wanted to mention one, which is one that people care about a great deal, and that's that to achieve and maintain sustainability, that may require regulation of groundwater pumping by the GSA. And what that means is that a GSA would have authority to regulate groundwater extraction, to register production wells, impose spacing requirements, perhaps, control groundwater extractions, put on meters, require annual reporting, and then monitor compliance and enforcement. So,
Mr. Victor?
Go ahead, Supervisor Munzer.
Please.
It's a question. Is this including household wells?
There's a rule in SGMA about what they call de minimis wells, which are the very small wells, and they do not have to be subject to this law.
Okay, all right. And then going back to the ag well, if this law supersedes water rights, is that a takings?
SGMA is very clear that it does not affect water rights.
But you're putting meters on. You're regulating. And again, I don't mean to be argumentative
go right
with you.
Ahead.
But
the state.
But how is it not a taking if you're going down the path of regulating someone using what is their right to have?
I think that there's going to be a lot of discussion
in the courts.
Probably.
Thank you.
I mean, and that is it's a key place. But again, as we seek sustainability, clearly there's going to be a lot of projects where it's like if you need the water, bring the water in, which has basically been what the district has been doing for all of these years. But frankly, in some basins where there's a shortage, maybe there's going to need to be regulation. But the whole idea, I think, of SGMA, again, is local control. And, in a lot of states across the country, it's very centralized with the state, and they regulate wells. And here it's, have local control in the community, in the county, in the water district. And, so if you all have to cut back, you're all going to be in a room and work it out together. So I think that's, again, from a layperson's perspective, how this is going to work out. So an important point here is that it may require regulation, but it needs to be consistent with applicable city or general plan. And then again, unless there's insufficient sustainable yield in the basin. What this law is about is achieving sustainability in basins where they don't have it, where they're overdrafted. And then if it is sustainable, then maintaining it. And so, again, it's a very complex law, highly detailed, but it's basically put out there for local communities, local agencies, to work through this, together and, find your way. So at this point, I think I'm talking too much.
Actually, you know what? Actually, you might be talking more. We got some questions.
Yeah.
Supervisor
Oh.
Botello?
Yeah, I have a question. I just because my understanding is this is a state big problem, and if I was a manager in a basin in a water district that is in a serious overdraft, and that's what we're trying to address. I understand what Sacramento's doing here. Is that, well, heck, why wouldn't you not buy water somewhere and transfer it down, similar to what we do here? We bring in water from the Central Valley Project, and that has really helped our basins to a point where they're very, very healthy.
Yes, sir.
But that's not the case in other areas of the state. Are we going to see water districts purchasing water to replenish their overdraft problems and driving up water prices, and maybe affecting our availability to bring water here?
I think this is a wonderful segue to Jeff.
Transition question.
Yeah, Anthony, you're always going to see water agencies looking for additional water. As far as long-term contracts out there that you can buy water, there are very, very few of those available. Pretty much all of the water in California is spoken for now. They're basically overprescribed in most of the projects, except in exceptional years like this one. So as far as those other agencies or areas that you're talking about, most of those are already importing water if they have an issue, with the exception of like maybe Pajaro, which doesn't have access, and that's because they gave that option up many years ago. So you will see that happening, but as far as on a mass scale, that there's going to be additional, probably not, just because there's just not the water contracts available to do that.
And you have yours secured for?
Yeah, ours is secured for right now until 2027, and that's when our contract renewal comes up. But it's basically almost an automatic that the contract gets renewed for another 30 years, and there are 30-year periods that the contract gets renewed. And the Bureau of Reclamation is going to want to renew our contract because by 2027, I'm still going to owe them about $80 million.
That's all. And how much do we have available to pay them?
Right now, there's about $90 million that we owe them. We have stepped repayments, and we're kind of going beyond what what the discussion here was about. But that $90 million that we owe them now is facilities that if you had to get that rebuilt today would be $300 or $400 million. So it's a deal. So basically what I wanted to show you here was that in San Benito County, we have basically what the area that we're involved with basically what we know as San Juan Valley, Pacheco, Bolsa, and the area out in Paisanos and Tres Pinos. Those are the areas that are been determined to be a medium priority basin. So we're not a high priority basin, we're a medium priority basin, but that's the area that needs to be managed in our county. There are two other small areas, and one of those is the Delta Mendota Basin that's out in Panoche. It's a very small piece that moves into San Benito County. There's really nothing going on out there, not in San Benito County. There's not, to our knowledge, there are no wells. There's no activity out there, so there's really no reason for us to manage that. So that was one of the areas that we decided we're not going to try to manage that. We'll leave that up to the
Jeff, hold on. We got a question. Supervisor Munzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So,
Yeah.
Jeff, that basin, is that beyond the solar project?
Yes. It's
Okay.
on. So for all of us in San Benito County, it's out. If you're going out towards Mercy Hot Springs,
Yes.
it's out that road towards Mercy Hot Springs.
And that's beyond. So, in other words,
It's
the
not
solar
be-
project can't pull water out of there to wash their panels?
I think it would be very difficult. I don't know exactly how far away they are from where that is. They'd probably have a hard time pulling water out of there just because I really don't think that that's a real part of that basin.
Sure, yeah.
I don't, if there was a lot of water out there, that somebody would have been using it by now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So that's what we're focusing on. There is one other small piece of the Pajaro Basin that comes into San Benito County that we have not identified as an area that we want to try to manage. And that's primarily because the bigger portion of that is being managed by Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. They're the ones that's managing the big portion of that. And there's a portion of that basin that goes into Monterey County, and both Monterey County Water Resources and San Benito County Water District both decided that we're not going to try to take that on. We're going to let Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency deal with that. You did not get a letter or a notification of that yet, and I think that's because the state's still trying to work through with Pajaro. I haven't heard anything about what's going on. So that's where we are with the areas that we're going to manage. There are other areas, other basins in the county. Obviously, there are many other basins that DWR has identified, but those are generally very low priority basins. The Panoche, Kinsabe, and Bitterwater, and those basins. That there's not enough activity out there that the state has determined that those weren't being managed. So kind of getting back to the district and the history of what's been going on, San Benito County Water District in one form or another has been managing this basin for about 100 years. Started back in the early 20s when it was the Hollister Irrigation District, and that morphed into the San Benito County Water Conservation and Flood Control District, which is now what we are today, the San Benito County Water District. But we've been doing this for about 100 years. We've been monitoring the groundwater basin. We've had a series of monitoring wells out there for the last 100 years that we've been monitoring and keeping track of, and monitoring those water levels. In the 50s, the Water District recognized that there wasn't sufficient water to keep the basin in balance and started to look at other projects. And that's when the San Benito County Water District at that time started to look at the Hernandez project, and at the same time started looking at what was ultimately going to be the CVP project, the federal project. So we started identifying those opportunities and looking at that. In the 60s, Hernandez was built, and also in the 60s, the legislation was passed through the federal government to authorize the San Felipe unit of the Central Valley project, and that's when we started moving forward with what we call blue valve water today. So we have been collaborating with the local agencies for a very long time. In fact, our groundwater management plan was the district collaborated directly with the county on that, and the groundwater management plan update. We've been collaborating with you folks and working with you to try to manage water supply and water supply issues, for a very long time. Getting to in addition to that, the Hollister Urban Area Water and Wastewater Master Plan. The county was originally, and one of the original agencies that the Water District and the city of Hollister got together to form that area that seemed to be giving everybody heartburn about how to deal with the fact that we've identified that area, and that was to help manage the groundwater and water quality and wastewater issues within those areas. So we have been, while the state has said you must collaborate with the land use agencies, we've already been doing that. We've been doing it for years. So we don't need the state to come in and tell us, they've done it, but okay, we're already doing that. In addition to that, the Water District's been, since the 60s, has been preparing annual groundwater reports. So every year we've been monitoring the groundwater, determining what the condition of the groundwater basin is in, and produce a report that indicates how much water is available and what the condition of the basin is in. So for the Sigma timeline that we're looking at here, since the district has put in its application and notification to DWR that we were going to be the groundwater sustainability agency for San Benito County, and we did that primarily because we felt that the San Benito County Water District was the best agency to do that. We didn't see anybody that had any other interest at that time that was interested in doing it. We had the resources, we have the data, we have a major portion of what's going to be required in the groundwater sustainability plan already done in the groundwater management plan that was updated in 2003. Because of the new laws that are required, there will be updates to it and additional work that needs to be done. But we've been doing that, and so we're a step ahead of most agencies already in doing that. Because we're a medium priority basin, we don't have to have it done until 2022. But my plan is for us to have that completed by the 2020 date. And so that's the direction that we're moving towards right now, is to have this in place by 2020. As far as the other steps that we're going to be doing, we're going to be doing outreach to interested parties, the city, Sunny Slope, you folks. We're looking at the basin boundaries, and we're doing some basin boundary modifications with Santa Clara Valley Water District. There's a portion of what we know as the Pacheco area that is within our basin, but is actually in Santa Clara County. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have an MOU with Santa Clara County that we manage that portion of the basin. And so we're going to take on that responsibility. And it's primarily because it just makes sense. We're basically doing the monitoring up there already anyway. We have a series of wells up there that we monitor and keep track of the groundwater up there, and it's primarily because that's water that comes out of that area that feeds the northern portion of our basin, and so it's important to us. We also operate stream gauges up there in Santa Clara County. So San Benito County Water District pays for the stream gauge at Walnut Avenue that's actually in Santa Clara County on Pacheco Creek. So there's a lot of benefit to what the district does. In fact, those stream gauges, if you watch it when we had the issues on Pacheco Creek in Lover's Lane, if you watch that stream gauge, you could tell that at a certain point there was going to be an issue on Pacheco Creek, because you could see that rising limb, and when it got above 5,000 CFS, you knew that it was headed to 10, and you're going to have an issue. So those things that we're doing, and that's all to manage the basin and water supply, are important to our county. We're going to be looking at initial funding to applying to the state for funding to do the groundwater sustainability plan. There's the state's just come out with the guidelines for applying for that funding, and that's going to be due, I think, in July or
This fall.
This fall, okay, is when those applications are going to be due. So we're working already on trying to find the funding to help pay for this. That's all I had, with a few exceptions. In the slides, that there's going back to Supervisor Munzer's concern about additional restrictions on groundwater pumping and registering wells and such. Majority of the area that we're looking at we're already doing that. In the majority of the area that we're looking at managing here is what we call Zone 6. And that's where the federal project brings water into. In all those in that area, all of the wells are currently already have meters on them. So we monitor the extractions. They're required to be registered. We're already, as far as some of the other requirements that are in the Groundwater Sustainability Act, we're already doing almost all of those things that a groundwater sustainability plan requires. As far as monitoring, well construction. I mean, we handle the well construction and well permitting for you from the county, so we keep track of all those things. There are some areas that could use some help, and those areas are in your district, Mr. Munzer. There is an area.
We say all the time.
And so there might be an interest in you to see that there are some additional requirements for wells and monitoring in those areas. There is a particular vineyard that is taking a lot of water out of Tres Pinos Creek and causing everybody else around them some major issues. And I'm sure you've heard about it. But my hands are...
My son-in-law might work for him.
Oh, that might be why we didn't bring it up then. But basically, the water district's hands are tied right now because we don't have any authority to do anything about monitoring the extractions out of those particular wells. And so it's all about how to manage the water and how to manage the water fairly so that everybody gets a fair share of it. And so there's no intention on the water district's part to try to interfere with what the county does. We don't have any intention to do that, and never have. Again, like I said, we've been working with you folks for years to try to do this collaboratively, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job.
There's one area I don't know about the other board members that want you to interfere, and that is Tres Pinos Water District. But that's a different issue.
Yeah, I can't help you there.
Okay, questions, comments?
I just want to comment that I want to thank Jeff and I'm sorry, Iris, for coming down and giving a presentation. And this is really important stuff for us to understand, and it's informative, especially with these new laws that are coming down the road for all of us in California. And, I have complete confidence that the GSA belongs in your realm. That's what, from my personal perspective, because it's just an extension of what you're already doing with the groundwater management plan. And, you're monitoring, the wells and within the basin already. Is there any practical purpose for as maybe our county council suggested, having a MOU in this endeavor from the water district's perspective?
Only if you thrive on additional layers of government.
We love that. No. No, I don't think, personally, I don't think we need that at that GSA level, or even, and you're right, and part of your presentation, the collaboration that we already have with, you do water and you do it real well. We do land use planning, and we do land use planning.
Anthony, in the absence of all of this, the water district would still be able to comment on any of those land use plans or CEQA documents or water supply assessments or any of those things on the viability of the water supply for those projects. We have done that in the past when there are issues that we see. But I don't see that. The water district has never taken a position that we want to limit growth or control growth in any way. We've collaborated with the planning department for many years, reviewing plans as they come through to make comments on what the issues that the planner should be looking at from a water supply perspective. But I don't recall any time where the water districts tried to interject itself into the process to tell you whether you should approve a project or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, but trust me, Jeff, sending that letter really has a heavy weight on the decision that a board will make. It will.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there a way to get this thing back on?
You going to make a presentation, Barbara?
I had a few extra slides, but I'm not sure we really need them.
Yeah, I was looking at your
I
thing
had another couple maps. They did a really good overview. Yep. I think that the main issue I already set forth in the staff report the various government code sections that talk about when different, like, general plan amendments had to be forwarded to the GSA for comment. And so, the closing thought that I would just present to the board is that, sometimes if you given a set of facts to like two different entities. Two different entities based on the same set of facts could come to different conclusions. So it's not that there's any, the water district does an excellent job right now, but I'm trying to look like 20, 30, 40 years into the future about what happens, in the future, whether this is something that the board wanted to permanently delegate, have the San Bernardino County Water District have control of, because, like a hypothetical example, if there was a 300-unit subdivision with a general plan amendment and we had to do a water supply assessment, yes, currently they can comment on the CEQA document, but then this would also have, the GSA would have an opportunity to comment. So, what happens if there was, a difference of opinion between the county's, view of whether or not there was adequate water in that situation versus like if the GSA came back and said there's not adequate water for it based upon X, Y, or Z situation. So that's my closing thoughts for the board, and I just leave it up to the board about what the board would like to do at this point in time. If it has no interest in moving forward, then it can cancel the public hearing that's scheduled on the 23rd, and if you want to continue, for further discussion of it, then that will continue to stand that date. Regardless of what happens, there is that one little area that Jeff mentioned that we will have to disclaim, any intention to be the GSA, because it's not one of the medium priority basins, and it's mainly in Merced County, and so we have no need to manage it, and we should just indicate that we're not going to take any responsibility for that. And staff can do that.
Any questions to staff? Then let me open it up to the public. Marty?
That was going to be my comment. Marty Richmond from Hollister. Not to go into some kind of a enormous MOU, but to formalize it with a letter saying we agree you're it, and get one back from the water district saying we got your letter and we agree we're it. So I just think I understand that it's another piece of paper, but sometimes these formal pieces of paper serve a good purpose, because you're not going to be here forever, and the next person who comes along can see that you've made this decision and they've acknowledged that they're it. I would like to speak to the board and through the board to my representative on the board, Supervisor Munzer. And my rule about life is you can kid everybody, never kid yourself. This is the first step of the state taking over the groundwater management. I think everybody should get ready for that. This is the camel's nose under the tent, whether you like it or don't like it, if Marvin was here, he'd be going nuts. But look, the word unless is in here already. It's all yours unless we don't like what you're doing, in which case we're going to come down and help you. When I worked for the Inspector General, we used to start every briefing with two lies. We would say, we're here to help you, and the unit would say, we're glad to have you. Okay? Those are the two lies we'd start with. In this case, we're starting with another lie, which is, oh, we're really not going to take any of your rights away. And we say, sure, we understand that's what's going on. The truth of the matter is, this is step one, and as we go along, they will pull one by one all the restrictions on it eventually. And they understand that it'll all be fought out in court, and they will pull them one at a time, go to the courts, fight it out, pull the next one, go to the courts and fight it out. And eventually, my guess is, knowing the way the California Supreme Court sees things, sooner or later, this will be a state-run operation. They will delegate it to the water district here and to other places, but the state will essentially say, we have the final say on whether or not you can use that water and how you can use it. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marty. Anyone else in the public? None? That's it? Okay. Comments? None? Okay. Which of the options does the board wish to take? Do we need also a direction on that little small pocket area?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. What's the wish of the board?
Well, I honestly think the water district's doing it, a fine job. They're obviously the agency that should do this GSA. They've got the data, they got the staff, they have the know-how. Maybe if we did write a letter recognizing that and sending it to the Regional Water Control Board, if that's even a requirement, but I don't even know if that's a requirement.
No, we don't have to, well, for the GSA, for the 3 basins in the county, we don't have to do anything. It just happens automatically if we don't take any action.
That's where I would be at myself.
So that would be like the option 3.
We got so many other problems. and maybe send a letter to the Regional Control Board and say the Delta Mendota Basin is really, not, we're not going to set up a GSA for that. And that's it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Supervisor Buncer?
I think I agree with option 3, and I agree with maybe we'll send a letter to the water district, and maybe the water district can send a letter back acknowledging our right to implement land use decisions, knowing what Mr. Richmond said, that all this is going to go away and the state's going to eventually be in control of it anyway. So, in other words, maybe they can just,
Yeah, I think
acknowledge receipt of our letter, and in that receipt of our letter, acknowledge that we have the right to determine land use.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Supervisor Medina? Done? Supervisor Rivas? Okay, so you don't need a motion. I direct staff to...
What about...
Yeah, and then...
Do you want to do a motion for option 3, which would be to cancel the hearing then on the 23rd and just send the letter?
Okay, is there a motion?
I'll make a motion that we do that.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Okay, motion carries. Make sure you send the board a copy of that letter before we send it out.
Okay. Yeah, they authorized the letter in the option 3. Letter. Yeah.
I thought it was the letter to us.
Yeah,
No,
no.
it is a letter to you guys, Joe. It is.
It's the option,
In 3 there.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was a correction.
Yeah, if the letter,
The intent of the motion was to send it to San Benito County Water District.
option 3 also, and we can bring that letter back and just put it on the next agenda item for the board, just a standard letter for that. And then the option 3 includes the letter regarding that Delta Mendota
Correct.
basin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we have 2 more closed sessions left.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Closed session. Barbara, we don't need to yearly announce it, so we're going to closed session. We're going to closed session. Anyone from the public wish to discuss any of the closed sessions? None?